It's been a fat fucking minute since I've done a Redeye Raw, hasn't it? I've never done one by candlelight before. Thought that would be something special and fun and kooky. But for this one, I thought I'd do another Life of Redeye. I'm not gonna do the one yet about the, crazy stuff when I was in 5th grade, which I promised I would do one on. I will eventually, don't worry, I will. But if you're new to Life of Redeye, it's a sub-series of Redeye Raw, and if you don't know what Redeye Raw is, it's unedited video with just me here on the phone camera, sometimes the webcam, just kind of yakking on here. But Life of Redeye is my life stories. And today, thought I'd try one that's a little bit of a hot button issue, but not as hot button. It's not like super hot button anymore. I mean, it's debatable. But that's religion. Now, I myself am not currently a particularly religious person, but I wouldn't call myself an atheist either. But until the age of 16 or so, I was very, very religious. Like I said, I'm not atheist. A large part of me still does believe in God. I don't know if I have all the information about the nature of God and things like that. And I don't necessarily think that God necessarily follows any specific religious rules or anything like that, but for my own reasons, part of me still kind of does. Maybe it's just conditioning because I've grown up knowing that my whole life. Maybe it's because I genuinely feel I am watched over, even if that doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. But sometimes, life just feels that way, even when shit's going absolutely terrible, which it can, for sure, at times. But I'm not currently super-duper religious. I was raised in the Mormon Church, or the LDS Church as it's properly called, or for the actual title, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, obviously, I grew up in a heavy Mormon area, and came from a family that had been in the church for generations, and I took it very seriously. When I was much younger, I was a lot more judgmental about it, a lot less accepting of other ideas, which is antithetical to everything I stand for now. But I took it very, very seriously. I was the one who would tell my parents that, hey, we need to go to church and things like that, when they weren't maybe as active as I was in the church. Again, around the age of 16 is when I left. We'll get there in due time, but I took it very seriously for a very long time. And I learned most things about the church. I know almost everything about the church because I grew up in it, right? And I took it very seriously. However, despite that, I've never actually read the entire Book of Mormon all the way through. Nor have I read the Bible all the way through. And here's the thing a lot of people don't realize. The Mormon Church uses the Bible. They do. It's technically a Christian religion. They believe in Jesus Christ and all that. They just have their own set of beliefs. And the Mormon afterlife is very different from the typical Christian afterlife. What the Mormons believe is that there are actually 3 kingdoms. The celestial kingdom, the terrestrial kingdom, and the telestial kingdom, all of which are supposed to be way better than Earth. Mormons don't really believe in hell per se. They do have 2 things that could kind of be considered close. There's spirit prison, which, from what I understand, is actually not really supposed to be prison. It's more like purgatory, really. And then Mormons do baptisms for the dead to get them out of that. Basically, the only criteria to get there is to have not been baptized in the church. The other one is outer darkness, which there's literally only one way to get there. You have to basically know for a fact that God is real. You have to basically have seen him face to face, and then actively preach that he doesn't exist. You have to literally know it in your heart, and absolutely know with 100% certainty, no shadow of a doubt, and then go out of your way to teach against him. That's literally the only way to get into the Mormon equivalent of hell. So everyone else is set. They're going to one of the 3 kingdoms, no matter what. That's very unique as far as religions go. I gotta say, I personally find it much more fair than the whole hell dynamic, because hell is eternal suffering, right? And I've always found it strange, the concept of eternal suffering for a finite crime, infinite suffering for a finite crime. Then within the celestial kingdom, there's actually 3 levels. I don't remember really a whole lot about the first 2. I think this first or second one of them is the people who would be considered angels. But basically, when you're in the top level, you basically become a god and get to create your own worlds. And the criteria to be there is you have to be an active member of the church and have been married in the temple. So this is for like the cream of the crop. Oh yeah. But it's a thing, isn't it? It's an interesting concept, and one that I've always found fascinating. I mean, I believed it when I was younger, but I've always still found it fascinating even after I left the church. Now that said, like I said, I personally find that much more fair than hell, although it does really not lead to disincentivization for bad things, right? Because no matter what, you're set. Like, you're still going to be better off no matter what. But around the age of 16, I was a priest in the Mormon religion, which doesn't hold the same weight as being a priest in, say, the Catholic religion. It basically just meant I could baptize people. And I could bless the sacrament, which is kind of similar to communion if you're a Catholic. It's a little bit different. The sacrament is done with bread and water rather than wafers and wine. And rather than it being like a special thing that's done on specific Sundays, it is done every single week. I don't know a whole lot about communion. I've never been to actually, I have been to a Catholic church for a wedding, I think. Or some other thing. I might have been to a christening or something. I don't know. I've definitely been to a Catholic church, though, because I had cousins that were Catholic. You know, there was one time where I went with my friend to this all-Spanish Mormon church. And I didn't speak Spanish at all as a kid. So I was just sitting there while they were speaking Spanish to me, because it's just like we went to church together at that time. And it was really awkward. Because they were just speaking to me in Spanish, and I was just kind of sitting there nodding and smiling. I remember I used to do what was called home teaching, which you're allowed to do starting from the age of 14 when you're made a teacher, which is one step below priest. And essentially what home teaching is exactly what it sounds like. You go and you give a lesson at someone's house, you and a partner. And I would do that. You know, in the Mormon Church, they had their idea of the priesthood. And they actually had 2 kinds of priesthood. There was the Aaronic priesthood, or the priesthood of Aaron, I believe as in Moses' brother. And then there was the Melchizedek priesthood. And the Melchizedek priesthood was higher than the Aaronic priesthood. I never got up to Melchizedek priesthood, only to Aaronic, which priest is the top level of Aaronic. But there's a lot of other ceremonies and things that I never learned about because I never got to. There's things called an endowment ceremony, and then there's a temple marriage, neither of which I ever went to, and I don't know a whole lot about because I'm still a little superstitious about. Even though I left the church, I've never actually looked into them. I know there's a lot of stuff that you're not supposed to talk about because they're considered sacred within them, but I've never done it, so I don't know. But you know, it was definitely a different me back then. In some ways better, in some ways worse. I've definitely gone through multiple phases as a person. But the reason I left at the age of 16 was I was going through that conspiracy theory phase, right? Where I was questioning everything in my life. Which I ultimately think is a phase everyone needs to go through. Because it helped me find sort of myself as I am now. For better or worse. And I've talked at length about the whole conspiracy theory phase I went through and sort of how it changed me drastically as a person. Multiple times, actually. There was the initial phase, and then there was the later phases. But again, we've already talked about that before when I talked about how my political beliefs changed over time. I remember there was this older lady that I used to deliver the sacrament to. So again, that's the thing that's similar to communion. And when I delivered it, she was this older lady that had this huge house full of books. And that's where I actually got my 1930s encyclopedias, which I've shown in a video before when I did my Facts in the Late 30s video. I need to do more of those. And I also got a recipe book, and I actually made one of the recipes in it. It was called Tasty Tuna in the Shell. And there's a really old book I got called Nuts in May, but I don't remember where that is. I'm curious now, because I got a lot of old books from her, like old, hardbound versions of Reader's Digest, other things like that. I want to say I heard that she died a few years back, too. I know that she sold her house and moved away, but I think I heard that she actually died not that long ago. But she had a really nice house. It was a small house, but from what I understand, it sold for like $500,000 or something like that. And this is back in like 2008. As for the church itself, there's some things I think were ultimately good that it did for me in helping me, grow up, learning those things, those morals, because I do think that having a moral basis on things at the beginning of your life is a good thing. But there's some things I don't agree with. There's some things that I think can actually be kind of unhealthy, like you're not supposed to masturbate and stuff like that. And I think that kind of repression is actually really unhealthy. Because you're also not supposed to have premarital sex. And a bunch of other stuff. But I think that leads to, that's why Mormons always have such short engagements and get married young. Because they want to get in and do it. And, I have mixed opinions on that, for sure. I do think that, again, it is good to practice some restraint with things like that, but I do think that there's a point where it becomes repression rather than restraint. I also think some people can become very judgmental in the church. I don't think that's necessarily the doctrine itself, although it definitely can lend to it. There are definitely judgmental people I've known throughout my life, my younger self being one of them. But my grandparents and stuff like that have always been fantastic, and they exemplify what a good Mormon should be. So I think that there's definitely a little of this and a little of that, and the good tends to get overshadowed by the bad when people talk about it. And that's why I really get upset, even though I'm not in the church anymore and I have my own gripes with it. I don't like when people badmouth it when they get stuff wrong. Because I remember there was a YouTuber I used to watch. I'm not going to name names because it's not about that. But he did a video talking about the Mormon Church. And I remember he acted like shunning was a very common thing in the Mormon Church. And that's not to say that it doesn't happen. Because I've seen it happen where some families will, shun their family members who leave the church. But it's never been something I've seen in my personal experience. Nor is it something I've seen to really be taught in the doctrine. Because, they were comparing it to some of the shunning in, say, Jehovah's Witnesses. Which, that's actually taught. So, I think. I don't know. I've never been a Jehovah's Witness. So if I'm wrong on that, somebody correct me. Yeah, it's something that I don't like that was very misleading. They also said that you're not allowed to drink caffeine, which isn't entirely true. I do know there's some congregations that teach not to, but it's not actually in the doctrine or principles of the church. There is something called the Word of Wisdom that specifically mentions hot drinks, and that's interpreted a little bit differently depending on which congregation you're in. I find that they typically mean it to mean tea and coffee, specifically black tea. But hot chocolate, things like that, are typically considered okay. And every church I've been to has not had a problem with, say, soda or energy drinks. That's always been accepted. But I have many family members that are still active in the church. Like I said, I left at around age 16. I actually did start going again around age 18 or 19, maybe a little bit later than that. I was going for a little bit, and then I stopped again. I was just going because, not necessarily because I wanted to, because here's the thing, I don't agree with absolutely everything that's taught. But there is a certain feeling you get, whether it's just a feeling or if it's something more substantial, when you do. I do remember that there was, in health class, we were taught about spiritual health. And I do feel like that we are always seeking something more. Whether that be through religion or the paranormal or whatever. I think that we are always kind of, searching for something more than just the physical and, what we conceive in our minds. And so I think that's part of why I started going back briefly. I haven't gone again in at least 2 or 3 years. But I still wasn't as active back then, and it wasn't like I was getting back into it. I was going just for the sake of going. And it's not like anyone told me to either. I was just trying to see, because again, it was self-exploration. And who's to say I won't go back again or go somewhere else or do something else? I don't know in the future. The future's a mystery. And like I said, I don't consider myself an atheist. Again, I don't necessarily think that any one religion has all the answers. But part of me is kind of a spiritual person. It's not a side I show very often. It's something that's definitely been lessened and overshadowed throughout my life in recent years. But it's still deep down in me. Something deeper wanting more. But I'm also a rational and realistic person. There are certain things that I was taught growing up that I just simply don't believe anymore. I can't really get into specifics because I honestly don't really know any right off. I mean, I've definitely had my opinions change on many things over time. There are certain things that have always been consistent, but this isn't necessarily about opinions or beliefs. It's really just about experiences and what I lived, Because I think there's plenty of credence to both theism and atheism. And I do put some stake into both in my thoughts. That's why I've never really called myself religious either. I'm much more of an agnostic, but agnostic with a lean towards theism to some regard. Whether that's actual, active theism, or if it's something to the tune of deism, where it's, a God that's, not necessarily involved in anything. He's just kind of there. But religion has always been a fascinating subject to me, because it's something that used to be much more prominent than it currently is. I feel like we don't really see it as much in today's day and age. And part of me thinks maybe that's part of why society's gone the way it has. That's not me saying that necessarily religion is something that I agree with, especially organized religion. I have my problems with that, because I'm all about critical thinking and the Socratic method and coming to your own conclusions, which is why, again, I'm not religious either. But part of me thinks that the world doesn't have a whole lot of morals anymore. And whether that's a good or bad thing, I think is kind of subjective, but part of me does feel like society has gotten worse. And again, I don't have the right answer either. That's the problem. I also feel like we're also always searching for answers. And I do think a combination of both science and philosophy go into that. I think that there's a lot of interesting scientific discoveries we've made in recent years that are very important, very fascinating. There's also a lot of things that are strictly theoretical or hypothetical, and those are pretty interesting too. It's funny, because many years ago, I feel like if you weren't religious, people would give you strange looks or judge you outright. Nowadays, if you are, I think people tend to judge you on the other side, or they give you a weird look or think you're crazy or something. And I think that's a little bit unfair. Because again, I'm not a religious person. I'm not. I still watch, atheist-type videos. Like, I watch Logic all the time. I find him entertaining, and I think he makes good points. But there's still a side to me that does look into the more religious, spiritual, philosophical side of things. And I find that fascinating, too. I'm always broadening my horizons both on the rational and the spiritual sides. There's two sides to that, to looking into things. And I always find it interesting. Never thinking that I necessarily have the answers, but just thinking about different possibilities is something I've always enjoyed doing. And part of me likes to think there's something after life. I don't know if there is or isn't. I hope there is, because the idea of completely losing your consciousness and just ceasing to exist, that scares me. Some people find solace in that. They think not having to exist is a beautiful thing. Others believe in things like past lives, which I'm not ruling out either. Reincarnation, things like that. There's all sorts of schools of thought on that, as it were. But I just don't know. I don't think anyone truly knows. There are plenty of people who say they know, especially on the religious side, too. Especially in the Mormon Church, because we never say we believe, we say we know. For instance, there was this thing we would do called bearing our testimonies. And almost everyone always started out with, I'd like to bear my testimony, I know this church is true. They don't say, I believe it's true. They say, I know it's true. And I thought I did too. I truly believed I knew without a shadow of a doubt when I was younger. But I don't know. I think I do plan to read the Bible at some point, in all honesty. If not as a genuine, religious text, at the very least, as an interesting look at the writing. Especially with some of the parallels to the book of fucking Revelations we've been having in this last couple years. Look at that. It is prophetic. Again, could just be coincidence. That's always possible. But there's a lot of things that I feel like... Also, the Book of Isaiah. There's a lot of shit like that. The Mormon Church actually has part of the Book of Enoch. If you guys don't know what the Book of Enoch is, it's actually a book that was removed from the Bible. And it's actually taught in the Mormon Church. It's part of a book called the Pearl of Great Price, which is one of the scriptures. So, the Mormon scriptures, they use the Book of Mormon, obviously. Everyone knows about that one. There's the Bible, the King James Version specifically. They don't use the New Revised Version. There's the Pearl of Great Price and the Doctrine and Covenants. Again, I've never read any of them in their entirety, but I have read many verses and bits and pieces in them. I have read Moroni chapter 10 of the Book of Mormon in its entirety, because that chapter is fucked up. It's one of the most fucked up things in there. It has I can't remember if it's the Nephites or the Lamanites, whichever ones are the bad guys in that chapter, because they go back and forth multiple times. I think it was the Nephites that were the bad guys at this point. But they make their enemies, they kidnap them, brutally torture them, rape their wives, kill the husbands after they've tortured them brutally, feed them to their wives, then feed the children to their... Or maybe they feed the mothers to the children, one of the two, or maybe a combination of the two. It's really graphic and fucked up. Not to say that the Bible doesn't have some fucked up stuff, too. Look at the book of Job. That poor guy, am I right? And there are plenty of religious works that I find interesting, too. For instance, The Prince of Egypt, still a great movie. Still easily my favorite 2D animated DreamWorks movie. The Road to El Dorado is up there, but I think the Prince of Egypt's better. I haven't seen... I have seen... what's it called? Is it, Joseph, Code of Dreams? Something like that? I have seen that one. But it's been many, many years. I also used to watch VeggieTales when I was younger. That was a fun show when I was a kid. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with learning religion when you're young, because, again, I do think it gives you a moral groundwork. And it could be true. I don't know. I don't have these answers. And another thing I've always found fascinating is the approach some people take to religion, such as John Cleese, one of my all-time favorite comedians, one of Monty Python, and in my opinion, the best member of Monty Python. John Cleese has always said that, religious leaders are very smart people who often speak metaphorically, and he believes that the Bible is a very good book, but it shouldn't be taken literally. That these stories are meant to be metaphors. They're meant to be parables that give you examples on, how to live your life or how not to live your life, things like that. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with having those stories with morals. Whether that was their original intent or not, I think it's a good way to look at it if you're not approaching it from, say, an actual theistic approach. That said, I do plenty of things that would be considered immoral by the Mormon Church. I've reviewed plenty of hentai on this channel. I think that's pretty abundantly clear. So it's not like I believe that these things are absolute, but it's a nice guideline. I've also drank, not a lot, not recently either. I haven't had a drink in a fat minute here, but I do drink occasionally. I like whiskey. I've had cigars. You've seen it in my videos, at least once, specifically once, in a snack review. I've had 3 cigars in my lifetime, and frankly, I like them. I will be getting more eventually. I don't plan to smoke them regularly. They're a special occasions type thing, too. So there are plenty of vices that I've definitely had, but I do think it is good to have a moral foundation to base things on. And I've ultimately had interesting experiences in my life growing up in the church. But because of that, I am who I am now. Because I do think if I hadn't have grown up in the church, I would be a very different person. And if I hadn't left the church, I would be a very different person. So ultimately, every phase of my life, I feel like has been important in varying degrees, in one way or another. This video is not intended to be a commentary on whether or not religion is true. It is not intended to criticize or belittle anyone for having differing opinions. Simply my life experience growing up in a religious family, and at one time being a religious person. And, like I said, I am not an atheist. But I'm not super religious either. I don't know what I am. That's really where I am. It's something I don't feel I have the answer to, and that's why I don't feel like atheist is accurate. There are some atheists, like Logic, who I mentioned earlier, who would insist that that is a type of atheism, but I think that that's splitting hairs and being semantic. Much as I love Logic, that's one argument that kind of gets on my nerves. Anyway, I think that's enough for today. Hopefully this wasn't too controversial or too cringy for some people. Yeah, it's always been an interesting topic to me, religion. And it's always been something that fascinates me, and it still will. And I do plan to continue pondering such things. Because I'm not an atheist, I do plan on exploring multiple ideas. Not something I'll talk about probably again on the channel, but just thought this would be a nice Life of Redeye to kind of round myself out. And I will get to the crazy stuff from 5th grade eventually. Anyway, toodles.